Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast, theendofhistory.net, and today we are beginning our series on the Empire, the 250-year story of American history in honor or in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of American independence here in 2026. So this episode today, the first episode, it's actually a two-parter. So we're going to have an episode 1A and episode 1B. You can download both of those now if you want. Encourage you to start with episode 1A here. We're going to take a look at America and Europe before Columbus's discovery, before 1492. So this one is called The Old World. We're going to go ahead and jump in to this first one and look at what was going on in North America prior to 1492. And then in the second episode, we will look, and it's also available, like I say, we'll look at what was going on in Europe prior to 1492. So that is coming, and yeah, let's go ahead and jump in.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So time, our perspectives of it, they're often a swirl of misestimations. I'm not sure if that's actually a word, but I'm going to coin it. Misestimations, misunderstandings. Everything is older and younger than we realize it to be all at the same time. I remember sitting in a room with my great-grandfather, and he described why he liked Franklin Roosevelt as a young man. And I realized that he could have sat in a room with his own great-grandfather and heard him discuss why he liked President Andrew Jackson. FDR seemed like history to me. Andrew Jackson seemed like ancient history. Much of our history has occurred much more recently than we realize, and it's also gone on much longer than most of us comprehend. Think about this. Cleopatra lived closer to the creation of the first iPad than to the creation of the first Egyptian pyramids. She lived closer to the creation of the iPad than the creation of the first Egyptian pyramids. In fact, the Great Pyramid of Egypt was older to the ancient Romans, led by the Emperor Nero, than the time of Nero is to us today. Harvard University was founded in the U.S. before Isaac Newton had even published his laws of motion and gravity. Some of the world's oldest living whales that live, like whales in the ocean, that live in the ocean today, they were alive when Herman Melville, first published Moby Dick back in the 19th century. By the time of Abraham, the father of the faith, whose life is recorded in the book of Genesis, by the time he lived, the first inhabitants of North America had already crossed over the land bridge that once tied North America and Asia together up around Alaska. In fact, that land bridge, exposed by the pulling back of waters from an earlier ice age, it had already been recovered, hidden again by water by the time Abraham, the father of the faith, lived and died. The Ice Age was over. The first populations of North America were already expanding, were already dominating the continent that Abraham and his descendants would not know about for the next several thousand years. If you're a fan of history, then like me, you're probably intrigued by stories of lost civilizations. I'm talking about things like Atlantis, right? You've heard of that. Atlantis. The Greek philosopher Plato described this technologically advanced society that was destroyed by some kind of cataclysm and disappeared from history, possibly sinking into the Mediterranean Sea. And these kinds of lost civilizations are usually more associated with myth than historical realities. But we like to wonder, what's out there? What have we missed? What's out there that we've forgotten about through time? And the thing is, there are real-life lost civilizations and cultures. The landscapes of North and South America are dotted with the remains of these lost worlds, if we take the time to look. They came, they conquered, they rose to their heights and pinnacles, then collapsed into oblivion, long before Europeans ever touched the shores of the Western world. Most of them did anyways. One of the earliest North American civilizations that archaeologists have identified is known as the Clovis culture. The first discovery of these ancient peoples, they were found in the tools and the weaponry they left behind in modern-day Clovis, New Mexico today. If I'm not mistaken, I've driven through Clovis many times on I-40, Interstate 40. Yeah, Interstate 40 through New Mexico. But that's where we get the name for this ancient culture, Clovis, New Mexico. They were thousands of years before Abraham, before Moses. They were also thousands of years before other ancient civilizations in North America. That's how old the people, the civilizations, the cultures were on the continent of North America. And that's where the story of America's history has to begin if we really want to go back to the beginning. It starts in northern Asia, where small groups began to move across what we call the Bering Land Bridge. That was about 20,000 years ago. Because so much of the ocean's water in this part of the planet was locked up in that ice age that I was talking about, well, the sea levels were shallower. And a land bridge that connects modern-day Siberia to Alaska, it was accessible. It was available then. And it was across this land bridge that the first ancient peoples crossed into the Western Hemisphere, slowly made their way south into North America, eventually reaching Central and South America over the next thousands of years. Today, we can look at the DNA and trace the similarities, the stories of these ancient Native Americans, all the way back to their Asian origins. Those who migrated further south into Mexico, into Central America, outward into the islands of the Caribbean and places like that, their descendants would actually be the ones who first met Christopher Columbus. We'll look at that in the next episode. But that wasn't really the first encounter between Americans or the people of the land we call America today and the Old World, the Eastern Hemisphere. Those were different civilizations, ancient civilizations. Even the Clovis civilization faded away and new civilizations arose in the lands we call America today. Their descendants would meet some of the Spanish conquistadors who explored parts of North America all the way into the 16th century. Others would meet the French and the English as they arrived around the Great Lakes region of North America, and then on the Atlantic coast in the 17th century, like the Pilgrims, the Virginia colonies, stuff like that. What's important to realize is how distinct, how varied these ancient civilizations of North America were. For me, it's hard to shake the mindset of these ancient tribal figures walking around North America, barely clothed, hunting and gathering to survive. Even that phrase, hunting and gathering, it makes me think, at best, of advanced cavemen, right? Not civilizations. And the fact is, that's just not correct. That's not a correct view of the people who inhabited the lands we call America today prior to Columbus's contact, Europe's contact and connection of the New World to the Old World. There were empires, there were civilizations spread out over many parts of the North American continent. The biggest were indeed in Central and South America, right? That's the Inca, the Mayan, the Aztecs, and others. These civilizations had massive cities that rivaled and even surpassed some of the major cities of Europe at that time. They had pyramids that you can still visit today. You can walk among the ruins, the relics of those times. And scholars estimate that on the North and South American continents, from modern-day Canada to modern-day Chile, there ranged populations totaling somewhere between 60 and 100 million people well before European contact. Now, that's massive. In fact, if that larger number, 100 million, if that's correct, that's even bigger than the population of Europe was at the time that Columbus set sail in 1492. These people in the Western Hemisphere weren't just living in caves and trees. They were living in civilizations, cities, villages. They had governments, religions, deeply entrenched cultures. And those cultures and civilizations would be massively impacted with the arrival of the Europeans. They would be almost decimated, in fact. And we'll look at that more in the next episode. But you probably know a lot of those stories already, right? Further north, though, right? Further north from South America, Central America, and the lands we call America today, those stories are usually a little less familiar. We're familiar with the Inca, the Mayan, the Aztecs. On the modern U.S. map, there's a place called the Four Corners, where Arizona, New Mexico, the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. This region was home of the ancestral Puebloans, right? They were the ancestors of the American Indian tribes, such as the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, Laguna peoples in the southwestern U.S. And the ancestral Puebloans, their culture, it developed over many centuries, flourishing especially between 100 and 1600 AD. That would have been around the same time that the Roman Emperor Caligula was ruling, up until around the time of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. That's where these people were living. That's when they were ruling and settling and living a civilization, had a civilized life around the Four Corners area of the United States, the modern-day United States. These guys built an extraordinary range of architecture, from early pit houses to multi-story stone pueblos and the iconic cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the Pueblo Bonita, and the Canyon de Chelly. You can see some of the remains of these ancient cliff dwellings today if you go to the Mesa Verde Cliff Palace. Those were built probably around the 12th century. The ancestral Puebloans, they're renowned for their stone masonry, astronomy, community planning. Great houses were built, and they were built in a way that aligned with celestial events. They engineered reservoirs and check dams, and along with agricultural terraces to farm in the arid environments where they lived. And these civilizations gave rise to this priestly and political class, which orchestrated the culture's cohesion with nature. These priestly rulers of these civilizations, they used astronomy to convince the people they could manage the agricultural cycles. And so as a result, the priesthood class did, they exercised enormous control over the ancestral Puebloans and their system of life, from agriculture to the traditions that made up the culture. The largest complexes and dwellings were often reserved for this powerful elite, this priestly elite, until the magic started to fade. As climate change entered the picture, droughts. If you go out to this area of the country today, of the United States today, you'll be familiar with, you'll wonder, how can they have agricultural systems? Well, climate change entered the picture. Droughts interfered with the priestly predictions, with their sense, their perception of control of nature. The temperatures began warming, not just in America. This was happening in Europe too. The end of the beneficial climates meant that crops failed in this part of what we know as the U.S. today. People died. When the severe droughts struck in the 1200s, maize harvests collapsed, and essential resources like water, deer, fuel, wood became scarce. Because their religious system promised balance and rain through proper ritual, this repeated agricultural failure, it likely began to undermine the social cohesion, the trust in the priestly class, the trust in the ceremonial leadership. Chaco Canyon, it was a hub for this ancestral Puebloans. And the historian Daniel K. Richter, in his book, Before the Revolution, America's Ancient Past, he describes how this centerpiece of the civilization, this ancient civilization, followed the pathway of other ancient empires and civilizations, rising to the heights of excess and then collapsing under the weight of inequity. This is what he writes. He says Chaco Canyon became a black hole into which goods were imported, but from which nothing tangible was exported. The society turned into a mini empire, divided between a well-fed elite living in luxury and a less well-fed peasantry doing the work and raising the food. In the same passage, this author, Richter, this historian, he goes on to mention the famous dwellings. And I'm just quoting directly from the book here. He says, differences in life continued after death. Great houses included rooms clearly designed as tombs where the bodies of an elite few rested, with an array of such exotic goods as turquoise, shell beads, rare minerals, ceremonial sticks, and pottery vessels. None of these goods appear in the graves of lesser individuals, buried simply beneath the floors of their unit pueblos. It reminds me, when I read about that, it reminds me of the pyramids of ancient Egypt, or the tombs of the Vikings, or the famous Chinese dynasties, or even the tombs of the elite of Europe during the Middle Ages. And that's honestly why I enjoy the study of history, and this particular study of the story of the American Empire so much. As we dig into this story, we learn that rather than being exceptional, America's story is one of greater evil, or it's not one of greater evil or greater righteousness than other societies and civilizations in human history. This is just the way of humanity, not the way of the ancestral Puebloans or the Romans or the Egyptians or the Europeans alone. People do this. Our civilizations tend to generally flow and follow the same broad strokes of the historical story, always degenerating towards oppression of the strong over the weak. So as climate stress intensified after the peak of the ancestral Puebloans and their civilization, conflict, migration pressures, and the resource competition, it started to really grow. Ultimately, communities abandoned the Four Corners region and they dispersed toward the Rio Grande, the Hopi Mesas, where their descendants continued. But the civilizations were much scaled down by the time the Europeans arrived in this area. Further to the east, there was another major civilization. The Mississippian Cahokia civilization flourished between 1050 and 1350 AD in what's now southwestern Illinois, directly across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis. At its height, the city, not the village, the city of Cahokia, covered roughly 6 square miles and supported a population of between 15,000 and 20,000 people. That made it the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica in its area during that era. All right, think of it like ancient Rome, sitting there, right there in the flyover states of America today. The city featured more than 120 earthen mounds. There was these platforms or conical mounds and ridge-top forms that were used for political, religious, and residential purposes. The largest of these mounds, it was known as Monk's Mound, and it remains the biggest earthen structure in North America today, rising about 150 feet and covering 15 acres. You can Google this. You can go take a look at it. You can even go and visit it to this day. It's near Collinsville, Illinois. Most people don't even know it's there today. All right? There's lost civilizations all around us, the evidence of these lost civilizations. Our own Atlantis, our own lost city of Atlantis sitting right there in Collinsville, Illinois. Modern archaeological excavations and core drilling show that the Monk's Mound was constructed in multiple stages using different types of soil and carried by hand in baskets. So that revealed a highly organized labor force, centralized planning. The mound originally supported a massive wooden building over 100 feet long, likely the residence or the temple of Cahokia's ruling elite. It had botanical gardens, and soil analysis suggests it was built more rapidly than once even believed, possibly over several consecutive decades rather than just centuries. So those findings highlight Cahokia's engineering sophistication, the political complexity of this civilization. The name Monk's Mound is misleading. It makes you think of a pile of dirt. You should instead think of it something more akin to the pyramids, again, the pyramids of Egypt. Scholars believe it may have taken 370,000 days of labor in total to build this colossal building project that consisted of more than 22 million cubic feet of soil. Again, all transported in baskets. So you had something that would have looked like slave labor doing all this work on behalf of the priests who were once again atop the society and literally living atop this structure. Monk's Mound is the largest of these structures, but it's one of many scattered across the society, the territory of this ancient society. There were probably 200 of these man-made mountains. And in some of those mounds, there's evidence of extensive burials taking place. In one mound, there's evidence of human sacrifices. In others, there's dignitaries and elite that were buried there. The common people were buried in separate cemeteries. Once again, the thing that brought an end to this civilization, climate change, became the great foil of this civilization. In fact, one catastrophe after another struck the city of Cahokia during the 1300s, more than a century before the Europeans had even arrived. A half-century of droughts gave way to a major military attack that burned the city down. There was even a major earthquake that disrupted Monk's Mound. As the Mississippian civilization supported this priestly class who said they could bring the rains, just like we saw in the ancestral Puebloans, they said they could bring the rains and the sunshine that would bring forth the crops. Well, when the climate shifted, When the crops that they were growing stopped growing, the faith in the social hierarchy collapsed and the civilization dissolved into smaller scale structure or smaller scale cultures across the eastern half of modern America. Smaller civilizations and cultures allowed for greater equality, more manageable cooperation among those groups. This is important to our story at the beginning of American history because it altered the way the Europeans and the Native Americans saw and dealt with one another. The Europeans saw tribal societies and were usually unaware of what preceded these natives that they encountered. Far from savages, as the Europeans often saw them, the Native Americans were just as sophisticated as the Europeans were. Their societies, their civilizations, they just evolved differently. As an example, there's a critique I've often heard regarding Native Americans, and it involves their lack of creating the wheel. When you look at the history, the story of Native Americans, you seldom see anything that looks like a wheel, right? And so that criticism suggests that the belief that the Native Americans were just as sophisticated as Europeans is ridiculous because these primitive peoples didn't even create a wheel, right? They weren't sophisticated. They didn't have that kind of technology. But that's a misunderstanding of the situation. It's a misunderstanding of the facts of history. The ancient civilizations of North America did, in fact, know about the wheel. Archaeologists have found the wheel on some of the ancient tools, some of the ancient toys. What was different was that they didn't use the wheel as a primary instrument of their agriculture. And the main reason driving that is because they didn't use draft animals to pull carts and plows like the Europeans did. Oxen, mules, cows, horses, those didn't even arrive to North America until the Europeans did. So it was a completely different agricultural system in the Western Hemisphere, and that meant a different way to farm. But that didn't mean that the agricultural system in the West was backwards. In fact, it was the West, the Western Hemisphere, the hemisphere of these ancient civilizations that introduced potatoes, corn, to Europe. When the Europeans came over, they met these new crops and products that were easy to grow, and they took them back home. It wasn't the other way around. Those came from the West. Think about that. We associate so much of Irish history with something like potato farming. But the potato didn't arrive in Europe until the age of European settlements in North America. Corn crops and different variations of it originated in the Americas and came over to Europe with the New World discovery. These crops revolutionized the agricultural systems of Europe, of Africa, of Asia, but they had been going on for centuries in the Americas. And the reality is, the civilizations of the New World in the Western Hemisphere, as Europeans came to call it, were very different. But they weren't at all backwards. Even with all its differences, the world of the West and its people were very much like those of the East. Take the dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans, or the massive mounds of the Mississippian peoples at Cahokia and elsewhere. The common view is to prop up these dwellings and worship sites as evidence of the backward primitiveness of these ancient civilizations. But again, they aren't quite as ancient as we hold them in our imaginations, and they certainly weren't as primitive, at least not in comparison to what was going on in Europe during this same time period. I just want to read this passage again. This is from another passage from one of this book by the historian Richter. He writes, unbeknownst to medieval North Americans on the opposite side of the Atlantic, others were likely raising monuments to a new kind of agricultural system. Who would at first think to juxtapose cathedrals with their soaring columns of stone and windows of stained glass with the towering walls of Pueblo Bonito, or the earthen mounds of Cahokia? Yet the comparison is worth pursuing, if only because the style of Western European architecture, later known as Gothic, and the distinctive notions of sacred landscape it created took shape in France and England almost simultaneously with their North American counterparts, and reached full flower at the peak of the warm period, he's talking about climate change there, in the mid-13th century. Usually built on ancient holy sites and often incorporating portions of much earlier buildings, cathedrals, this is in Europe, cathedrals like temple mounts often took generations to erect. Church buildings in France during the 2 centuries after the year 1050 required more cut stone than did the entire architectural history of ancient Egypt. So in Europe, as in North America, massive structures were erected. We call them churches. We call them cathedrals. The warming of the climate during this same time period proved an answer to the prayers prayed at these cathedrals in Europe. In many instances, the churches were built atop cemeteries where the dead were buried. The buildings lent credibility, meant power, authority to the priests, and the ruling class would have been the Catholics during this time period, there in among the European aristocracy. The match isn't exact, but it's far closer than most of us realize. The western half of the Old World, the world before Columbus's voyage, was far more advanced, far more sophisticated than we usually give it credit for. When the European settlers began to arrive on the shores of America over the next 2 centuries, they were often confused by what they encountered. The idea of a primitive savage, as many called the Native Americans at that time, it was really just something that was invented by these settlers, by these explorers, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into in later episodes. But this is the beginning of the story. And we have to see the reality of that beginning if we want to understand what followed. Right? Now, I want to pause right here. We're going to pick this story back up in the next episode. Episode B, part 1, episode 1B, I guess we'll call it, right? I want to pick up this episode, The World Before 1492, but in this next part, in the next episode, you can download or stream now, we're going to look at the shape and culture of Europe before 1492. This is really important for us to understand the story that follows. And I think you're going to be surprised by some of the details we identify. I'm not going to give away any spoilers right here, but you can watch for that episode to drop in the next couple of minutes. And it's available now, part 2 in our series on the American Empire. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.